Mine is the only voice.
Wow.
What have I been doing?
Lay down my autonomy.
After that, it got very dark very quickly.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Cults to Consciousness. My name is Shelise and today we're talking about some culty news involving the Bible Baptist Church in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I am joined by the awesome other podcast creator, YouTube creator. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric, with Preacher Boys.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so every time I see your posts on Instagram, you were just on it, calling out these preachers who were just continuously getting put on the chopping block as they should for doing things that they should not be doing, specifically with CSA or SA. So this is a content warning, guys. We are going to be talking about really sensitive situations when it comes to minors and grown men. So just be aware of that as we go through this because we are going to be talking about specific cases. So I wanted to have Eric on to talk about these cases that he has become aware of, and we'll talk about how he became aware of them and go through each one and talk about why we think this is a pattern, why this continues to happen amongst these groups, specifically today talking about this one church that is an independent fundamental Baptist church. So let's get into it. Thanks for being here, guys, live. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. Jonathan will be starring those, and we will be doing questions here in a few minutes. So, okay, Eric, let's get into this. How did you become aware of this situation and these cases?
Yeah, I did an interview several years ago, and I'm horrible at time. I think it was like maybe 2021, with a woman named Angela Snow. And she talked about her abuse that took place at a church, an IFB church in Canada. And we had that conversation. That led to some really incredible things. First and foremost, she had been told by police when she had first reported that nothing could be done with her case. And she shared that information on the podcast and talked about the statute of limitations and all those things we typically talk about. And a reporter from the CBC ended up listening to the interview and contacted her and said, there is no statute of limitations for the crimes that you experience. The police officers just brushed you off. And because of the conversation happening, there was a big CBC write-up. And then she ended up getting to sit down with the chief of police or whatever they're called in Canada, which is really, really cool. And so that was
Wow.
really interesting. But she reached out to me about a year ago, a couple months ago, and said, you need to talk to a friend of mine named Hannah St. George. And she's from a church in Fairbanks, Alaska, Bible Baptist Church. And it was really interesting because I'm about 5 years into doing the show. And I don't know if you feel like this, but I'm like, sometimes you get that feeling like, oh, I've covered everything, or I've covered all the big stories. And then something else happens and you go, oh yeah, there's a lot more. And this is why I do this. And this is why I keep doing
Yeah.
episodes. And that was definitely Hannah's story. So we got in touch. We had an hour phone call before doing a recording, started gathering documents and things like that. And very quickly went from, we might have an episode to let's record 3 or 4 episodes because there's a lot that happened to her personally. There's a lot that happened at the church, and there's ongoing cases that are happening connected to the church. And so, yeah, it was just a weird connection to a connection, and the snowball effect of just more and more information coming through, and doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, and people can find those interviews on your YouTube channel, Preacher Boys.
Yes, yeah, they're on the YouTube channel and the podcast. If you look for Hannah St. George on any Preacher Boys streaming platform, you'll see it. So,
Okay. So we are going to be playing a couple of clips today too, directly from the pulpit of this church so that you can see it with your own eyes, hear it with your own ears about the things that they are talking about to the congregation and why, I mean, it kind of gives you an idea as to why they handle things the way they do or at least how they handle things. I found it very uncomfortable listening to these clips. On one hand, they're saying things that make sense, yes, forgiveness and all of that, and can't totally judge a person or, all of that, which is good, but missing the context of actual child predators who have access to children in the congregation, it really gives you a different viewpoint of them saying these things in the terms of they're just covering up hiding and allowing these men to continue to have access to children. And that's where it feels really icky. So, we're going to get into some of that. First, I think we should go into some of the cases so that you guys know the severity of what we're talking about. And then we'll play a few of the clips. Do you want to go ahead, Eric, and just start going down the list?
Yeah, and I just want to make this really clear right out of the gate is that this is a handful of cases that actually have police reports and charges. There's a long, long, long list of stories that are rumored to have happened at the church where, there's victims who have shared privately things like this is just the information that I have where there's actual legal documentation to talk about it. And
Hmm.
so I'll go through these kind of quickly. We can zoom in if we want to on some of these, but um, you have Richard Booble, who was a junior high math teacher who was hired at the school connected to the church after he'd already been charged with second-degree SA. You have Carl W. Ginn, who was a volunteer and a missionary from the church who abused two minors. You have Anthony C. Varela, who SA'd a 4-year-old girl, and in spite of that, was hired as a janitor at the church and then rose in the ranks to leading the Spanish ministry there. And he was there for a really long time and was kept there until a family in the church that happens to be very well off started complaining about it. And according to people inside the church, it seems like there was a concern that they would lose a large donor to the church over it, which is why they took
And
action.
also, for this one, I just wanted to mention that the severity of this is the R word, but we're trying to
Yeah,
avoid getting demonetized, which it happens when you talk about these
it's
topics.
an
So
uphill
just
battle. Yeah,
for anyone listening, it's not that we don't want to say the words loud and clear and be very specific, but in order to get this news out there and in order for the platform to continue to promote us, we do have to be careful with the certain words that we use. But yes, this is the R word of a 4-year-old
yeah,
and has continued access to children until a wealthy donor said, I don't know about this. So that should tell
right.
you a lot.
Right. The next one is particularly horrifying, and I encourage people who are listening who want to hear the full story. You can listen to my interview, of course, with Hannah St. George. We go pretty in depth, and certainly not a monetizable conversation. But if you just Google the name, you can read a really good write up that shares this story in detail. But this is a pretty horrifying one. One of the janitors at the church was arrested with felony CSA and was literally caught in the act in the home of the victim. He was visiting with, I actually don't think I shared this with you in the notes that I gave you, but he was visiting with his fiance or girlfriend, I believe, to a family in the church. And he kind of went missing for a couple minutes. And the mom went looking, and he was in the room with her daughter, like undressed. And she confronted him. He grabbed his clothes, ran out the door, and yeah, the girl ended up confirming with police what happened. And in spite of all this, and in spite of him continuing to violate his parole, the police or the church has bailed him out and continued supporting him at the church. And then two more. Frank Boddicker Sr. Was arrested for attempted R word of his granddaughter. And then David Duffett, who is the youth pastor and also the pastor's son, the pastor who we'll watch in just a minute, was arrested for statutory R word of a minor under his care. And in spite of allegations swirling around him, he was retained as a youth pastor for years and bailed out by leadership time and time again. And so this just gives you kind of
Yikes.
a picture, like, and this is all within, a decade or two. And like I said, this is the tip of the iceberg of the stories that I've heard of the allegations connected to the church. And like I said, a little bit of digging reveals a lot from this ministry. But this is what we're dealing with. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. The sermon clips at face value to a random person might read as like, okay, some of this makes sense. I can jive with this, but without the context, it's like, yeah, you don't really know what you're agreeing to. The church member is
Mm-hmm.
sitting there going, do I agree with this sermon, who doesn't know that he's actually referring to X, Y, and Z, like can't really make an informed decision about putting their kids there or choosing to
Yeah.
financially support the ministry. And so keep all these stories in the back of your mind as we watch through some of these sermon clips and really paint a picture
Yeah.
of who this guy is.
So we'll start with the one about bailing people out because you just talked about this and we have proof that they did bail out and support the perpetrators. So let's hear it directly.
Some of the finest people in our church used to be in jail. Or let me tell you this, there's people in our church that should have been put in jail. But they
He's
got
right.
off.
He's right on.
Yeah. Somebody, I'm not gonna say who it was, Chris, but somebody got a speeding ticket. And I heard them jostling the person in the lobby, and somebody said,
So with this one, I thought I clicked the one that talked about bailing out, or did I miss it? He basically was like, some people have been in jail, some people should have been in jail. Maybe I chose the one that was shorter. But didn't he continue to go on to say, I've bailed some of them out myself? Or is that in the
Yeah,
next clip?
I think it's the next clip. There's like a longer
Okay.
version of it.
Okay. Well, for that, yes, it's like, yeah, we shouldn't judge people without knowing the whole story, and we should be there for people. We should support people. Obviously, if you've been to jail and you're out, you're maybe trying to rehabilitate, you're trying to get back to life, and we shouldn't automatically just cast people out because of their past. However, informed consent is really important. And when you're talking about people who have been in jail because of essaying children, I
No.
think you should know who you're sending your children to church with. And that's something
Right.
that was never part of their whole process, right? It was just avoid it or tell people to just forget about their past.
Yeah. Well, and all of his examples are nonviolent crimes. Like, and you know, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know certain of these sermon illustrations were used while some of these other crimes were happening in the background. And so, if you think of the examples he's giving of so and so got a speeding ticket, or you know, he actually had a couple different sermon clips all using the speeding ticket example. There's a major difference between a speeding ticket and a violent crime, especially a violent, you know, crime of sexual abuse. So
Hmm.
that's the kind of stuff where, again, devoid of context, you might agree with, yeah, if someone has a speeding ticket, we're not going to cast them out, or we're going to help them. But when you're dealing with the types of crimes that they're talking about, and even hiring staff who've been charged with some of these crimes, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and I kind of want to get your opinion. I want to get your opinion on this. In my head, it feels like they are virtue signaling of this person had a bad past, but we're going to take them in and we're going to give them a job and we're going to make them feel special, almost as if that's the right thing to do, or maybe in their heads that's what Jesus would do. I'm not saying he wouldn't, but I feel like that's kind of the direction they're going of, well, if we can accept them, then so should you. Oh, I lost your audio for a second.
Oh, can you hear me
Oh,
now?
there you go. You're
I
back.
was muted. A professional podcaster, everybody. No, I was going to say there is something else to it that people tend to gloss over, which is I think the churches reach out to these types of people very often because they won't be accepted anywhere else. And I think when you look at some of the individuals who are hired on as staff, usually underpaid staff or brought in as volunteers, there's a lot of leverage the ministry has over this demographic of person. And so I think that's an element too, is that we're going to bring in people who have horrific pasts, who have really know their options, and then we're going to employ them. We've got a lot of leverage over them to fulfill our purposes. And then on
Mm-hmm.
top of that, too, you're setting a foundation where if anything else does come out related to the church, or if any news stories do break, you can tell people, yeah, we prepared you for this. Like, it's time to minister to these people. And you're kind of getting ahead of the bad news that might be coming down the pike at your ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what I got with this next clip. So it's, I think, just about 3 minutes, and there's a lot to say. And I want to play the whole thing because it's very contradictory and kind of confusing. And I think that's what these pastors tend to do is just confuse everybody. So they're like, yeah, sure. So let me bring it up.
but you didn't do that. But you did steal $3 from this other thing. You don't just say, if you get accused of stealing $150 from the cash drawer at the grocery store, but you didn't do that, but you did steal $3 from this other thing, you don't just say, I pled guilty, I'm just a thief. Wait a minute. You're charged with stealing $150 from this cash drawer. How do you plead? Not guilty. I didn't do that. Well, I did take $2 out of the change machine, but I didn't do that. Are you listening to this? I'm just telling you.
So I'll just have to pause for a second because in some ways it makes sense. Like we're talking about, sure, if you didn't do something, then don't fess up to it. But in my mind, it feels like the parallels here are much deeper, especially if you said these sermons are going on
Yeah.
while this stuff is happening. It's almost like saying, well, if you only, and please forgive my example here, if you only touched someone but you didn't R-word them, are you really a pedo? It's like, this doesn't
Yeah.
feel right. Like, yes, you are a perpetrator. It doesn't matter the severity of the offense. You have earned yourself that title. And so it feels like he's trying to brush over this fact of don't label yourself bad if you didn't do the bad thing, you know?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's fighting for like, let's be 100% accurate, with our description, which, like you said, yeah, I can agree with that. But when you're saying, okay, I'm not going to say anything at all, like I'm going to completely separate myself from these
Not
allegations,
guilty.
like that doesn't quite work. And the story he connects this to is a story of someone in his church who is arrested for touching someone inappropriately at a
Let's
pool.
watch it.
And
Let's
yeah,
watch
let's
it.
watch and
Let's
see.
watch it.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Okay, how do I get back to that view? That one, okay.
I'm just telling you, whatever you're charged with, that's what your plea is. Right? That's what you're being charged with. And if it's, we had years ago a young man, he was in the Air Force, and the church wasn't as large as it is now, and he missed church Sunday night, which was very odd. And so the next day he came in to see me, and he was charged with inappropriately touching somebody at the pool. I said, what were you doing at a pool anyway, a public pool anyway, with all that nakedness? What are you doing?
Just have to point out that it's
I knew
almost
you're-
like an excuse. Like, well,
Yeah.
you were at a pool, of course you're gonna sin. That's not how it works. I just have to point out that he's almost giving him an out of like, well, you wouldn't have done it if you weren't with all that sin. It's just,
Right.
oh, so cringy.
There. And on a Sunday night, instead of coming to church, that I know I shouldn't have been there. But they accused me, and but I didn't do it. But when he said that, I knew he had done it. And the next day, he came back in and said, "Preacher, I'm guilty. I did do that." He said, "What should I do now?" I said, "You got to be honest. You've got to be honest, and you've got to tell the truth, confess when the charges." But when the charges came, they were things he was charged with that he didn't do. He said, "Now what should I do?" I said, "You ought to go to them and say, if you'll take these things off here, I will plead guilty." And they refused. They were stubborn and said, "No, we're not taking anything off. You're being charged with these crimes." He said, "What should I do?" I said, "You cannot plead guilty if you didn't do it. You got to plead not guilty." And so he did, and he got off because they could not prove it because he didn't do it. He got off. Should he have gotten off? Well, I don't know. Where do I miss those doors back there?
Okay.
He yada yada'd a lot of stuff. I think it's fair to say.
Uh-huh. Yeah, what are your thoughts before I jump in on this, Eric?
Well, first, I'm curious, like how similar, like the vibes of the sermons you heard in Mormonism are to the vibes of the preaching in the Baptist kind of world, and like the way they talked about these things. Like I noticed you jumped on, well, what are you doing at the pool? You're around all this nakedness. Like, of course you're going to, like I feel like that feels like it's got some a little Mormon-y flavor to it. potentially. But I think the biggest thing for me again is just like I said, he yada yadas a lot of stuff. Like there's a lot of things where, he said, "Oh, I didn't do it," so I knew in that moment he did do it, and then later he came and told me he did do it. But then there were other things he said he didn't do, so I took his word for it.
Mhm.
It's like what he picks and chooses to believe is a real trend among these stories. And again, the story that he ties this to is this version of, okay, if you take this much money instead of this much money, but then he ties it to a completely separate and different type of crime. And
Exactly.
and I just want to throw this out. And I think someone said something about this in the comments as well. If you can't go to a public pool and be around people without sexually assaulting someone, you should probably lock yourself up on your own, because that's a pretty concerning admission by itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was interesting that it came from the pastor. So if it was the guy saying, I have this history and I really shouldn't have been at the public pool because I know myself, then it makes sense for the pastor to say that. But for him to say, well, what were you doing at the pool? That was your first mistake. It automatically implies that men can't control themselves at public
Yeah,
pools. And so it's just the fault of the quote nakedness and the people who are there
yeah,
because they're kind of asking for it. And
yeah.
that's
It
where
blames
it
the
bothers
victim.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So with that example and how he just kind of brushed off, well, should he gotten off? I don't know. And then maybe we shouldn't play because it's going to take too long. But he goes on to be like, well, you were shown a mercy. And so now you have to hold yourself accountable, which I can, yes, hold yourself accountable. But the fact is, he's very much pointing to, but not with the law. But then later in the clip, he goes, but the law is the law, and stealing is stealing, no matter if it was $3 or 150. And then the crowd's like, yeah,
right.
and like hooping and
Yeah,
hollering. And then I'm like, yeah, but in the earlier part, you're like, if you're not guilty of this crime, then don't call yourself a thief or whatever. It was just so back and forth and convoluted and confusing. And to outright say that stuff over the pulpit, it just makes me
yeah.
feel really yucky and gross.
Well, that's the crazy part is that, when I was prepping for the episode, and talking back and forth with Hannah, it was like she'd say, "Oh, my pastor said this," and I'm never surprised by anything. I'm like, "Yeah, I can believe they said that," and she's like, "Oh, he said that from the pulpit, like and live streamed it." And it's like, "Oh, okay, well, interesting," because that part usually doesn't happen. Usually, it's said in a meeting, or usually it's said
Uh-huh.
behind closed doors. To broadcast it is interesting move. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. So it seems like he is taking the stance of, well, if the law, like you were saying, semantics, if the law exactly accuses you of something, then yes, plead guilty. But if they don't have it completely right, then you're not guilty, and we should just let God deal with it, and you just need to
yeah,
repent with God. Which I have no quarrels with people asking forgiveness from God for something that they've done wrong, and also being accountable within the law and the
right.
people with whom you've hurt. It's a yes and, not just a, well, oh well, I'll just pray about it, because that's not how it works to be part of the world, to be part of a community, part of a church.
Right. Yeah, I always feel like an elementary school teacher, like explaining these things. Like I'm always like, you shouldn't do this. Like this
Uh-huh.
isn't okay. I don't know. Did I send you the clip where he talks about his stance on jail in
You
prison?
might, maybe I didn't see that one. Can you
Okay.
paraphrase it?
So yeah, and this ties in again where you're getting little drips of context that add flavor to what he's talking about. One of the things he talks
I
about
did
in
see
one
it.
of his
Sorry, I remember
sermon
now.
clips, he talks about nobody should be in jail. And he basically says, like, in the Bible, they didn't have jail. Like, you would just pay for your crimes. And
Uh-huh.
so, like, again, you've got these layers of if you do something bad, you should repent and talk about it. But also, we bail people out. But also, nobody should be in jail in the first place, no matter what. So, like, you keep building on this, like, where you're like, okay, so your worldview essentially is like everything should be handled within the church
Yeah.
by you, presumably, I would assume. And I just saw that comment. Who remembers that old church smell? That's so funny. But yeah, you start getting a bigger and bigger glimpse of his worldview, and essentially, it all comes back to come to me for the answer. Everything happens within the church. I'll tell you how to solve it, and then we'll go from there. But like
Mm-hmm.
his whole overarching view is nobody should be in jail for anything. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that he said openly. So again, everything you watch, the more context you have, the worse it sounds.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Without the context, again, I could agree with, sure, is jail the best place to rehabilitate someone? Maybe not. Maybe there are other ways or other mental health facilities that would be more helpful in getting people back on their feet in rehabilitating someone. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't go to jail. It doesn't mean they should be free to assault somebody else or harm somebody else.
No.
Just because jail isn't perfect, it doesn't mean no one should be there because we
Yeah.
haven't figured out a better solution. And so it's one of those, okay, I kind of see what you're saying, but also you're outright telling us that you're bailing people out because you don't want them to be there. But by doing so, you are putting them back in, you're putting everyone in harm's way and giving
Yeah.
them a place to work around children without telling your members who your faculty are. And that's
Right.
where I have the biggest issue, because people are only getting this feed of forgiveness and take it to God, and we shouldn't put people in jail and we should help people, but they're not getting the full story of, and these are the people who we are helping to rehabilitate, just so you know. When you bring
Yeah.
your kids here, these are the people we're helping and this is what they have done. Let's help them find forgiveness. Let's help whatever. It's just
Right.
not the full picture.
Yeah. And the other piece too is that, you know, and this goes into a larger conversation about like especially people who've been convicted of CSA, like whether they should be permitted within the walls of a church, which my answer is always no. And I know many people across all versions of this issue have different viewpoints. I don't think you should ever be permitted in a church again. I think if you are, it should certainly not be one where children are present. And that to me is a huge red flag when someone wants to be rehabilitated. They've just left jail or prison, or they, are on a registry, and they go to find God at a church that happens to have a Christian school and a bus program and huge sprawling youth ministries. When there are plenty of churches across America that have 30, 70-year-old and up members where they could go find God, or they could go to a home Bible study with other adults or people who've had the same, crimes committed. Like there's a lot of answers beyond that. And even beyond that, like the recidivism rate is extremely high. So the odds of someone in your church community being in danger is massive.
Yeah, someone
But also
commented something
like,
like that.
yeah, the recidivism rate is extremely high and it increases over time. The chances that they will actually commit another crime. Um, but again, if you actually are trying to minister to this person, which again I have my own viewpoints on, um, you know, why would you put them in a position where they can commit a crime again? And why would you be so arrogant to think that you'll be able to see the signs of someone who's obviously very good at manipulating and getting into places where they want to commit these types of
Hmm.
crimes? So just all around the approach is super backwards, and it's not good for the person who, if we do take them at face value and they're saying they want to change, it's not good for the people in the congregation that are ill informed, and it's not
Hmm.
wise of a pastor who might think he's able to handle these things when the people who are most qualified to handle them, the psychologists and the people who work with this day in and day out, are the first people to say that nobody knows and nobody can predict what's going to happen and how to control this stuff. So anyway, that's a whole lot of thoughts there, but it's a big cocktail for disaster when I hear pastors say stuff like this.
Yeah, two things that came to mind when you were talking about that. The first being, these pastors have this sort of savior complex where they're like, oh, don't worry, guys, everything will be fine because they're under my
I got it.
watch.
Yeah.
And that's just very egotistical and unrealistic, completely unrealistic. And the second thing is that just left my brain. the pastor with the ego complex. Oh, I wanted to talk about from your experience within the IFB, what makes these children at a higher risk being a part of this community? Not to mention there's already a predator, there's a shark in the water, but what makes them
Yeah.
more at risk being part of the IFB?
I mean, you could answer this one. I like the high control purity culture, is definitely a big piece of this puzzle. Lack of sex education is
Mm-hmm.
massive. Lack of any understanding of your own body is massive. And so I'd say that first and foremost is a major issue, that
Yeah.
a lot of people I talked to didn't even recognize that there was a violation that took place, and so that's huge. I would say a general respect of all adults is a huge one. Like, everybody who's an adult is an authority figure. That is kind of like taught or at least inferred by a lot of kids who grow up in these environments where, like, you don't want to disobey an elder. And so to use, not in the Mormon terminology elder, but any kind of older figure in the church. And so, there's a lot of fear of, like, if I say something, will I be in trouble? That sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But I would say, yeah, the lack of education, partnered with this, obedience that's pounded into you of, like, I don't need to rock the boat or talk about things that are above my pay grade, so to speak. And then I would say a layer even beyond that is, like, when something does happen, I'll pull from my own experience here. When I started calling things out at my own church, I was told, you need to forgive, you're being bitter, you need to stop talking about these issues, God's forgiven him, why haven't you? And so I
Yikes.
think the level of pressure put on you to handle things in a godly way is a big roadblock as well. So again, like, we could talk just purity culture by itself. We could talk about how damaging that is and how much it sets people up for abuse, even within the context of getting married and going through all the proper channels. Like, um, but on a surface level, I would say just not even understanding what's happening. And then on top of that, volunteers not being educated and, like, you've got multiple generations of people with the same level of education in those areas. Like, it's just like I said, it's a cocktail for disaster.
Yeah. I actually just posted on our Instagram around the time that I was like, are we doing this live? But it just perfectly coincides if anyone wants to go watch it, from an expert talking about how you talk to your kids to help potentially prevent something from happening to
Mhm.
them in a way that is age appropriate. And no, it's not going to take their innocence away. It's going to arm them to know how to handle a situation when something happens that makes them uncomfortable, when something happens that is violating their privacy or their private
Mhm.
parts, and how to come and tell you, get away from the situation and come and tell you, and what people may say or what people may try to, bribe you with treats or scare you with threats. All the things that you can say to your kids to help arm them against whoever, because you don't know where it's coming from most of the
Right.
time. When people have situations of CSA, it's from family members or people they know. It's from close friends.
Yeah.
So having those conversations are so, so, so important. And to your point, those are things that are not said. Those are conversations that are not had within these environments that only preach purity culture.
Yeah.
So let's get to a few questions. I'm sorry it's
Yeah.
taken so long to get there, guys.
No, it's a
Um, a few questions. Sherilyn says, pastor in mainline Christian denomination here. Oh, cool. I'll welcome offenders into our flock, but they must be supervised and the vulnerable protected. That's a very interesting perspective, and I appreciate you sharing. I think there are a lot of people who may disagree with that, but I commend you for making sure that they are supervised at all times, and hopefully the congregation also knows who they are around at all times. Do we have another? Nicola, it depends on the crime. Some things are unforgivable. You touch a child, you can never be trusted again. I will say, because we know through statistics that the repeat rate is through the roof, I agree that they should never be trusted around children ever again. That's something that from my own personal experience, I feel very strongly about as someone who's been through it. So I agree. Would you agree, Eric, on that?
Yeah, I in terms of, like, the esoteric conversation of forgiveness. I don't really have any. I have my deep personal feelings about. But for me, it's I'll say for me, it's unforgivable, and I think um, there's just absolutely no reason to try to reintegrate these individuals into context, especially where there are children.
Yeah.
Again, speaking specifically to the CSA side of this, SA is like a whole nother branch that I have, again, strong feelings about. But CSA specifically, the solution to me is very simple. They should be nowhere near children at all,
Yeah.
anywhere. And again, like I said, there's plenty of churches that don't have kids ministries. I raise an eyebrow when I see offenders like the one who went to my childhood church, whose wife eventually became the principal of the school. Like, that is way too close. It's way too much proximity. And I want to speak to the earlier comment too. I know there's many pastors, like I said, that think they can keep an eye on everything. But like I said, I've talked to psychiatrists who've worked for 50 years in the field, and they will still say that they don't fully understand how the mind of a predator works. And it can be easy to say, oh, well, watch the sweaty, scary, stereotypical person in the back pew. But the,
That's
I,
usually
I'll,
not
I'll
the
share this.
case.
Yeah. And I'll share this really quickly. And I know we've run over a little bit, but one of the most eye-opening anecdotes related to this was I interviewed someone whose father was arrested and started researching a lot of these things. And he said he talked to um, psychiatrists who studied predators, specifically those who commit CSA. And he said, what is the number one trait among all of these guys? And he said, the number one trait is that they're extremely compliant. They're the people that say, yes, sir, no, ma'am. They open the door for you. They're the most unassuming, like rule following, amazing people because they're trying to get access to kids. He
And
later
fly under the
talked to
radar.
some Right, yeah. He later talked to someone who sat on the parole boards who decided whether or not these people were ready to go back into society. And he said, "What's the number one trait you look for to see that they've been rehabilitated?" And he said, "We look for compliance. We want to see if they're willing to follow orders, obey rules." And he
Wait,
basically sat there and went, "Okay, so the number one way that they get access to victims is compliance. The number one way that they prove they've changed is compliance. We've got a big problem here."
what?
And I think that's a huge thing I would ask people to consider is like, what are you doing to measure transformation? Because if it's just that they
Yeah.
look great, like, how do you decide, as someone who I'm assuming has no degree and hasn't studied this forever, it's like, how do you determine whether that is a tactic or whether that's real change? And I don't want to be the one who, makes that decision and makes that call and puts kids at risk. Like, that's just not something I'm ready to do. And I think a lot of people are just way too confident. Like, they listen to some podcasts like this, or they read a couple books and they go, I know how the mind of a predator works. I know how these things happen. I know what the red flags are to look for. I watch some TikToks and it's like, it's really complicated, and these are predators. Like, they camouflage themselves, they know how to stalk their prey, they know how to separate them from the, like, we use this terminology for a reason. So the more you think the more in danger I would say you probably are. But anyway, I
Yeah.
just wanted to throw that out. Again, these could all
Yeah.
be 3-hour conversations. So
Most of them are master manipulators, incredibly
yeah.
charismatic. You would never suspect them for a second because they know what they're doing, because they
Right.
know they need to win over everybody around them to gain access. And so that's why
Yeah.
it's so frustrating. Wow, that's what you just said about the law. That's incredibly disheartening.
A
Okay, a
little
few more
scary. Yeah.
questions. Hey, Katrina, thanks for being here. My father was my offender. Ooh, that hits me. I know that he abused one other child. After that, he kept himself away from children, but that's an anomaly. He also apologized to me when I was an adult. Wow, you got an apology.
Yeah.
That's huge. I'm not saying it makes it better, and I'm so sorry for what you went through. I feel that deeply. Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Break the silence, break the cycle. Okay, Leah May. I grew up IFB and once had a pastor pray in chapel that all the girls' legs burn off. Am I reading this right? Burn off the next time they put on
Holy
a pair
moly.
of pants. Girls are extremely sexualized as young as nursery age. So sad.
There's a
What?
wild.
Hold on.
There,
Let me let that sink in. A pastor prayed that the girls' legs would burn if they wore pants. Can I also just point out that pants are more modest than dresses that can be flown up at any
I've
time?
I've always wondered this. I literally always would ask this when it's like, we're playing on the playground. It's like you're swinging from monkey bars in a skirt is probably not the most modest approach here. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a someday we could do a good reaction to some of the more insane clips, but there's one that comes to mind similar to that where a pastor at Fairhaven College was talking, and he was basically saying girls when they're like babies should not be put in sleepers because it'll get them used to wearing pants. So like in the IFB, they don't play about the
What?
whole pants thing. So I hope you're not putting your child in a sleeper because they'll get used to being rebellious and wearing pants around, which is the biggest
Oh
problem
my
you could have.
gosh.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about sexualizing children too and sexualizing little girls before they can even
yeah,
speak. It's like, come on, guys.
yeah, big no.
Girls weren't allowed on monkey bars.
I can't
Well, there
speak to
you
that from
go.
experience. Okay, they were allowed on the monkey bars, at ours. I'll throw one bone to the
Any
IFB.
Patty, what's the difference between a Baptist church and a fundamentalist Baptist church? I'm gonna let you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, so and some of this is like a little bit of a, you know, if you know, you know, kind of thing. But Baptist churches in general, like at a very, very, very like 10,000 foot view level, like they're just Baptistic. So they believe in baptism by immersion. And so there's other pieces to that, but like if we're talking like what's the correlation between like the Southern Baptists, and the Independent Baptists, and like all these other versions is like they're predominantly it's that they believe in baptism by immersion after accepting Jesus as your savior. It differentiates them from like the Catholics and like other denominations, but just generally Protestant Baptist casual church. Fundamentalist Baptist church can mean different things to different people, and there's different levels of extremity to that. But it just means, Bible literalists, they typically have stricter rules, which again, that just depends on where you're at. Like for ours, for example, it was not just believing the Bible is inerrant and infallible. It also means believing that it's specifically the 1611 King James version of the Bible is inerrant and infallible, and everything else is corrupt. It doesn't just mean that you should dress modestly. It means that girls should not wear pants. It doesn't just mean that you should abstain from the appearance of evil. And so that doesn't mean you should watch how you behave. It means that you should, not go to theaters because someone might think you're watching an R-rated movie. Like it was always in independent fundamental Baptist circles. It's the way that I describe it is just it's a constant moving goalpost of, okay, I think I'm holy enough. I think I'm doing enough. I think I'm strict enough. And then they move it down a little bit further. And so you're constantly chasing it. And they, like I said, some versions have more extreme views than others, but yeah, they're just a little bit more hardcore than the others.
Yeah. And doesn't it also ultimately come down to the leadership, the specific pastor who's at the head of it because they are independent?
Yeah, in the independent circles, like yeah, every there's there's a lot here too, but the all these churches operate very similarly. They all go to the same Bible colleges. They all hang out with their own respective crowds. So it's a lie to say they're completely independent. They have conferences together. So like they're clearly not, but they don't share
Totally
funds.
separate.
They don't have a organization over them like the Southern Baptist Convention. You've got like this structure and order. Like the IFB is more like a club. You're in it or you're not.
Mm,
And but each pastor is essentially the ruler of their individual churches. So instead of having, like a Southern Baptist church might have a group of pastors, like a teaching pastor and elders and things like that. IFB churches structure is typically senior pastor, maybe an assistant pastor, and then you have deacons. But like at the end of the day, the senior pastor's word is what goes.
yeah.
Most of these, like even having deacons is like they're just yes men to the pastor. So again, I'm trying to keep this very brief, but like we could talk
It's
about
complicated.
politics in IFB world forever and how none of it is what they say it is. Like independent
Yeah.
is not an accurate label at all. But
Yeah. With all of these differences, some maybe more major, some less intense, within all of them, I don't want to say all, within most of them, you can find the same patterns of manipulation, control, everything that creates a predator's paradise and puts these children at risk. And so that's why we talk about it. It's not to demonize a specific religion or a specific group of people. It's to point out the patterns of manipulation and control so that if you or someone you know is part of this, you can be aware, you can have your eyes open and not just take what the pastor is saying at face value, because as we've discussed over and over, what they're saying at face value isn't harmful. It's the context that's behind it, it's the intention behind it that is getting you to be blinded to things that may or may not come into your purview so that you ignore it. And that's why we want to call attention to it. I think that's why you, Eric, do what you do, right? You call
yeah,
out these preachers and you talk about the abuse scandals that are coming forward so people are aware that this isn't just, well, that church was just doing something wrong. It's
yeah,
a persistent problem amongst a lot of these groups that are high control, high demand, and putting their kids at risk.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's something I would just kind of reiterate is that, even the churches that are led by good men, most of them have the same systems that enable a bad person to step in. And I think that's again, it's easy to look at like a Doug Duffett who we watched clips from and go like, we can determine that's not a good guy. Like he's using this system to his advantage and he's using it to manipulate and he's using it to cover up. There are guys graduating Bible college every single year who are starting churches set up like a typical IFB church, where they truly do have good motives and they're trying to make a place that's, exemplifies the best things about their religion. But, having the lack of accountability and having the lack of education and having all these things that create a perfect storm where an abuser can thrive, like that's a big issue. And so I hope those people listen as well and kind of safeguard their own ministries. And a closing thought for people who are still attending churches, which I don't know, my audience is kind of mixed on who is and who isn't. I'm not sure about yours, but I would just encourage you, if you're attending one and you've got speakers coming through your church and you've got pastors coming through your church, just Google them. Like it's amazing how many people sit in church every single Sunday and never look into the person who's standing behind the pulpit. So, use information, use resources like Cults to Consciousness, like my show, and just handy dandy Google or ChatGPT and like search like, who is so and so? Are there any scandals related to this church? The amount of times people ask me, have you heard anything about so and so? And I Google them and it pops up with a police report. It's like, okay, well, I feel like you could have done this. Like, let's get our stuff together and start actually researching where we're putting our time, money, and most importantly, our kids.
Yeah.
Not enough people are doing that. So anyway,
Yeah, I agree. I think we have a few more questions before we close out.
yeah.
Oh, Whitney, thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate you. Todd, how do we handle situations where the parents don't parent? What do you think?
Uh, I mean,
I guess it
depending,
depends on the context of that.
yeah.
Oh, there you go. Like parents that don't have these conversations with their children.
I mean,
Well,
this is a very, I mean, it depends on your relationship to the family. Like,
yeah.
it depends on your relationship to the kid. Like, if you're a family member, it's a lot different than if you're a teacher. Like if something's happening illegally to them or something that's harming the child, you don't need to wait for parents to report it. I mean, you can report it.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to like educating kids who are not being educated the proper way, like that's a very, like, I don't even feel comfortable giving a piece of advice specific to that because it's so nuanced. Um, you know, uh, yeah, I want to be careful not to give advice that's gonna like not be helpful in that context. But I would say just being available and like, if there is an opportunity for you to be the person who will hear them, even when their parents won't. When it comes to like reporting something or talking about something, that's great. But I'd be also very careful about like stepping in and trying to parent someone's kids,
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. That's
Like I said, it's a
tricky.
messy area where it could be misapplied really easily.
Yeah.
So
Jonathan just told me that's the Todd from Costa Rica who came with us to go say, Todd, nice to have you here.
I could give a
Um,
lot better advice if it was a one-on-one with a lot of context as to what you're thinking about.
yeah. I think that's a really great position to have. I think if I were to say anything that feels like it could go over any context, is just be a safe person that the child knows they can turn to in case they don't feel safety with their own parents in disclosing information.
Yeah.
So whether that's I mean, this is so hard again, but whether that's just like, hey, if you ever need to tell me anything, I'm going to love you no matter what, always here for you, like something
Yeah.
as simple as that.
General
Or
support.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
being a safe place.
Yeah, because even that I would say like be careful, like because one of the tactics that predators use is having a conversation without the parents knowing. Like I
Yeah.
just think you can set yourself up for bad. I think being available is the good general advice where it's like if you're obviously close enough to this person to be concerned, a teacher, a someone who senses like something's not quite right, like giving those reminders like, hey, if there's ever something that is affecting you that you need to talk about, like I'll listen. Like that's
Mhm.
great. I think like pitting them against their like that's where it gets really messy. It's like
Yeah, you don't
um
want to pit them against their
yeah,
parents. I think
right.
just letting them know that you're an
You're
option.
there.
Yeah. So, all great stuff. Okay, I think we're ready to wrap up. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure we talked about today?
I mean, I want to make sure I threw in the Google people that speak at your church. So I already got that out of the way just in case. Um, I don't think so. I mean, like I said, I think the two sides of the coin that I have already mentioned is do your research, but then also on the flip side of that, like no amount of research will protect you from someone who is invested in, you know, preying on people around you or you. Like I think I think it's really easy, and I say this as someone who spends way too much time and it occupies way too much of my mental headspace of like how to prevent this stuff. Um, where I can start feeling like, oh, I understand this. I get this now. Or I feel like as a parent, I'm able to protect my kid 100%. Like the reality is we're not equipped for this. And that's okay because none of us should be able to think like a predator. But it's understanding like those kind of restrictions on us, those things that we can't understand, those things that we do have weak spots in, it allows us to make better decisions in like avoiding just complete areas that could be dangerous. So
Yeah.
I would just say do your research, understand basics. Like I said, understanding that I should Google people before I put my kid in a school or in a church. I should look for red flags. I should be looking for extravagant gifts being given to my kids or trips being taken with them or unsupervised time or secrets being held between a child and an adult. But also remember, like, there's no foolproof way to prevent this stuff. So, like, the best
Yeah.
thing to do is like keep your eyes open and have open dialogue. But yeah, you never know too much, but also you can never know enough, which can be discouraging, but also I think is a good reminder for people. So
No unsupervised visits with my children. And
right,
something that
right.
I'm going to make sure that they know is safe people don't keep secrets and teach them the difference between a secret and a surprise. That's
I
something
was
that I
just
keep
about to
learning
say that
over
that's
and
my
over
favorite.
again.
And we should say this just really quick because this is like one of the best things I like that I learned after having a kid, and I read it in a book, and I was like, oh, that's such a duh like way to talk about it. Y- Teach your kids very early on they shouldn't have secrets with anybody. They should only have surprises. So it's okay for your kid to have, with their dad, we're going to surprise your mom with this birthday party in a month. Keep that a surprise. It's not okay for their uncle to say, hey, let's have a secret, just you and me. And
Mm-hmm.
that is such a great reminder. It's so easy to teach at any age. Like it's fantastic. I'm so glad you mentioned that because that's a great little throwaway rule that like is so helpful. So
Yeah. Yeah, I've been learning lots of stuff from behavioral experts and child experts. I'm like, save, save, save,
Yeah,
all these
right.
rules. And when I find stuff that is relevant to people who've come out of cults or people who may know someone in a cult, I try to post it over on our Instagram at Cults to Consciousness. So if you guys want to follow, I'm usually putting stuff up there. And this is a semi-formal announcement, I guess. We're going to try and do lives every Sunday. We're doing our best to make that happen from here on out so that you can expect us to go live and join us. The time will probably vary, but we are going to try and do Sunday lives. So thank you guys for being here, for watching, for your comments, your questions. We really appreciate you. If you're in the replay crew, leaving those comments does help us, helps boost the algorithm, and we just appreciate your thoughts as well. And what else can I say? Go check out the interviews we have done with Eric, Preacher Boys, and obviously his channel. If you haven't subscribed, go subscribe to Preacher Boys.
And I
All of that is
interviewed
in the
you on the show,
description.
so you
Oh,
can
that's
listen to Shelise on my
right.
podcast. If you can't get
That's
enough of
right.
us, there's plenty of places to hear
Plenty of
lots of
stuff.
content. So
Yes, and then if you want to, someone said Sunday's Amanda's night. Uh,
it's
it
the
is,
Lord's
and
Day,
sometimes we
though.
do it
So
together. Yeah,
you know,
Amanda's gonna come visit soon, so we'll probably do another joint. We love Amanda. We'll try not to do it at the same time as her. And what else? You can get some merch, cultofconsciousness.com. I'm sorry for what I said when I was in a cult t-shirt is our bestseller. We're going to Mexico. Eric, you're totally invited at the end of October. If you want to come do some beachy stuff with us, it's going to be super fun. We have 5
sounds
people
very
signed up and
culty.
they all went to Costa Rica. It's not culty, I swear. They all went to
A
Costa
group of
Rica
us
and they're
is
like,
going
let's do
into a
this again.
tropical paradise. It's at least very White Lotusy. But
There won't
anyway,
be
sorry.
any seances, at
Not
least
not culty.
I won't be leading any seances. Whatever you guys do in your own time is up to you. We're just gonna take some boat rides and snorkel, all that fun
Okay,
stuff.
so
Um,
all good then.
so link in the description. And I think that's it. Do you have anything else you want to say before we go?
No, that's it.
Okay.
That's it. There you go.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. Follow your highest excitement. Be conscious and be well. We'll see you next time.